she'll be staying in the guest room my parents prepared. It's all arranged." The bride's confident voice cut across the reception hall like a spotlight, drawing every eye toward the stage and toward Margaret Ellison. The sentence was polished, rehearsed, and delivered as though it were merely a warm courtesy. But for Margaret, it detonated with the force of a quiet explosion. The hall glowed with soft amber lighting, catching on crystal glassware and fresh flowers. Servers moved between tables, carrying plates of roasted vegetables and champagne flutes. The scent of garden roses hung in the air, yet all of it blurred for Margaret. She felt an odd ringing in her ears, a narrowing of sound that allowed only Rachel's words to exist. She stood near the back of the room, her purse clasped in aging hands that trembled despite her attempt to appear composed. At 68, she had experienced loss, hardship, and loneliness, but never this kind of public dismissal. She noticed people turning their heads, whispering behind manicured fingers, their expressions shifting between confusion and pity. Her cheeks warmed, her breath caught. She straightened her posture the way she used to when standing behind the post office counter during stressful holiday rush hours. Rachel stood on the stage like a performer in full command of her audience. Her white gown shimmered under soft lights, and her posture exuded the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling the flow of conversations. She smiled gracefully as she spoke about blending families and new traditions, her tone dripping with the charm of a well-crafted speech. But every word sounded to Margaret like a polished blade. Margaret tried desperately to believe there was a misunderstanding, but hope dissolved when Daniel stepped forward beside his wife. His smile was thin, strained, almost mechanical. "Mom, it's fine," he said quietly. "They're already staying at your cabin. You'll love the arrangement." The phrase struck with a strange clarity, already staying. Her heart thudded once, painfully. That cabin had been locked, secure, and waiting. She had spent years saving for it, restoring it plank by plank with her late husband. It held their laughter, their grief, the silence they once shared on cold mountain nights. Now she pictured strangers lying in her bed, using her kitchenware, rearranging the furniture she chose with such care. The chatter in the room shifted. Silverware clinked less. People leaned subtly closer, sensing tension. Thomas and Helen, the in-laws, sat at a nearby table. Helen wore an expression of polite concern that didn't reach her eyes. Thomas lifted his champagne glass slightly, as though celebrating something he believed already belonged to him. Their daughter Sophie looked down at her phone, barely acknowledging the unfolding scene. Margaret's pulse quickened, her throat tightening. She recalled sanding the cabin floors until her knees ached, painting the window frames during winter drafts, planting wildflowers along the path with her husband before his passing. She had poured her grief and hope into that place. And now it had been claimed casually, publicly, without her presence or consent. She whispered, barely audible, "Why would he do this?" The question carried years of sacrifice behind it. Daniel stepped closer, voice low. "Mom, don't make this difficult." His tone held a hint of impatience, as though she were the one disrupting the evening. The word difficult pierced deeper than she expected. She had weathered storms in life without complaint, surviving more than Daniel ever knew. Yet here she was, framed as an obstacle. A quiet resolve rose in her chest. For years, she had allowed others to take up space she should have claimed. She had softened her voice, avoided conflict, prioritized others' comfort. But the cabin her sanctuary was a boundary she could not allow anyone to erase. With steady breath, she stepped forward. "No one stays in my cabin without my permission." Her voice wasn't loud, but it landed with unmistakable clarity. A collective gasp traveled across the room. Someone dropped a fork. Even the band, preparing soft music for the next toast, paused. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Mom, please? Not now." His eyes pleaded for her to shrink, to let it pass, to maintain the image of harmony he wanted to present. But Margaret felt something shift inside her. It was subtle at first, like a door unlocking after years of being stuck. She felt her spine straighten. She felt breath return to her lungs. She felt the weight of her own dignity reclaim its place. She picked up her purse, walked past the decorated tables, and headed toward the exit. People's eyes followed, wide and uncertain, but she did not waver. Each step away from the stage felt like reclaiming lost ground. When she pushed open the doors, the evening air greeted her. It was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from distant mountains. For the first time that evening, she breathed freely. She unlocked her car with steady hands. "I need to see it for myself," she murmured. The engine rumbled to life. Headlights cut through the darkness as she left the reception hall behind. The music, the speeches, the polished smiles, they all faded in her rearview mirror. Ahead lay the long mountain road, and with it, the truth of what had been taken and what she was determined to reclaim. Difficult. He called me difficult. The word echoed inside Margaret Ellison's mind long after she stepped out of the glowing reception hall. It lingered like cold air against her skin, sharper than the mountain wind she had grown accustomed to. She stood by her car for a long moment, fingers tightening around her purse, stunned by how effortlessly her son had dismissed her. The night sounds around the venue continued, as if nothing had happened, but inside her, something had cracked and shifted into place. She had spent her entire life avoiding conflict, finding gentler paths, swallowing her own discomfort so others could feel at ease. In her years at the post office, she had endured impatient customers, delayed shipments, and holiday madness without raising her voice. She had buried her husband quietly, mourned privately, and carried herself with dignity even when loneliness settled into her home like a second shadow. But this moment, the public humiliation at her own son's wedding, pierced deeper than any hardship she had weathered. The cool night air wrapped around her as she took a slow breath. The scent of pine drifted faintly from the distant mountains, reminding her of the sanctuary she had built for herself. The cabin had always been the one place where her voice mattered. Every nail, every wooden beam, every shelf was the result of her own hands, her own choices, her own life. And yet tonight, she had learned that others had stepped into that space as though it were theirs to claim. A dull ache tightened in her chest. She replayed Daniel's words in her mind, each repetition heavier than the last. He had not only allowed the intrusion, but defended it. At what point had he stopped seeing her as the woman who had raised him with quiet devotion and started seeing her as an inconvenience to be managed? Margaret opened the car door but did not step inside yet. Her reflection in the window caught her attention. The faint lines around her eyes looked deeper under the parking lot lights, and the silver streaks in her hair seemed brighter. For a moment, she felt older than she was, heavier than she wanted to admit. Then her eyes sharpened. Beneath the years, she saw something steadier, forming a resolve that had been dormant for too long. She whispered to herself, "This is my life, my cabin, my boundaries." The words felt unfamiliar at first, like a language she had forgotten but suddenly remembered. She straightened her shoulders and slid into the driver's seat. Inside the car, the muffled music from the reception hall buzzed faintly as she started the engine. Her thoughts churned quietly as she rested both hands on the steering wheel. Anger simmered below the surface, not wild or chaotic, but controlled and deliberate. It surprised her how quickly grief had turned into determination. She imagined Rachel delivering her polished announcement to the guests, smiling as though she had given a generous gift. She imagined Thomas and Helen watching with their subtle smirks and knowing expressions. She imagined Sophie barely looking up from her phone as though the entire moment were a mere passing inconvenience. None of them had paused to ask whether the cabin meant something more, whether it held memories or represented years of sacrifice. The cabin was not just a property or a weekend escape. It was her promise to herself that after years of service to others, she could finally claim a space of her own. A place where she read every morning before the sun rose. A place where her late husband's old wool blanket remained draped over the chair he used to sit in. A place where she cooked simple meals with herbs from the small garden she tended each spring. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel as she whispered, "No one takes that from me." The sentence settled inside her like a warm ember. She put the car in drive. The soft hum of the engine felt grounding, steadying her thoughts. As she pulled onto the road leading away from the reception venue, she glanced once more at the glowing building behind her. Through the large windows, she could still see silhouettes moving, laughing, celebrating. The sight no longer stung. Instead, it felt like something closing a chapter, quietly shutting its own door. The road ahead was dark but open. Streetlights became scarce as she drove farther from town, their glow fading behind her. The sky above widened into a canvas of faint stars. Her grip on the wheel loosened as she took another breath, her heartbeat settling into a calm, steady rhythm. Her mind drifted back to Daniel. She remembered the small boy who used to sit on her kitchen counter swinging his legs while she packed his lunch. She remembered the teenager who asked her to quiz him for math tests. She remembered the young man nervous before his first job interview, the way he hugged her and whispered that he hoped he would make her proud. When had the distance grown so wide? When had he begun valuing others, voices over hers? When had he forgotten that she had built her life from patience, resilience, and quiet strength? She did not hate him. The ache in her chest proved the opposite. But she knew now that love did not mean surrender. Love could not erase betrayal. Love could not excuse disrespect. As the highway curved north and the terrain rose gradually toward the foothills, Margaret felt the shift more clearly. This was no longer about a single announcement or a single moment of humiliation. This was about reclaiming something deeper, her autonomy, her voice, her dignity. She imagined what she might find when she reached the cabin. Boxes stacked in her living room curtains. She did not choose chairs. She had not bought shoes by the door that did not belong to her. The image made her jaw tighten. But fear did not come. Sadness did not grow. Instead, she felt a steady, calm certainty forming. She would not arrive as a confused guest or a timid elder seeking explanation. She would arrive as the rightful owner of her sanctuary. She would demand answers, and if necessary, she would take back what was hers. The mountains rose taller in the distance, their silhouettes sharp against the darkening sky. Margaret felt a strange sense of alignment, as if her steps, her choices, and even the betrayal she had endured had led her to this very moment. She reached forward and turned down the radio, which she had not realized was still playing quietly. Silence filled the car except for the rhythmic hum of tires against asphalt. Her voice was steady when she spoke aloud, this time not a whisper, but a quiet declaration. "I am going to my cabin, and I am ending this tonight." The headlights carved a path through the night. The road narrowed as she ascended into the foothills, the familiar curves of the landscape greeting her. The deeper she drove into the mountains, the lighter she felt, as though leaving behind layers of burden she had carried for far too long. The journey was only beginning. But in her heart, Margaret knew one thing with absolute clarity. She was no longer running from humiliation. She was moving toward justice, toward truth, toward the life she refused to let anyone rewrite. And the cabin waiting in the quiet darkness ahead held not only her memories, but the next step in reclaiming her dignity. The highway stretched ahead of Margaret Ellison like a long, dark ribbon leading into the heart of the mountains. As she drove, the lights of the city faded behind her one by one until the world around her was swallowed by a quiet vastness. Only the hum of the engine and the rhythm of her breath filled the car. The deeper she went into the foothills, the more the night seemed to lean in, listening. Her hands rested firmly on the wheel. They no longer trembled. Every mile she traveled felt like peeling back layers of shock and disbelief, revealing something steadier underneath. Yet the ache in her chest had not faded. It pulsed softly, reminding her of the words spoken at the wedding, the gleam in Rachel's eyes, the dismissive tone in Daniel's voice. The memories replayed like faint echoes she could not silence. As the road curved upward, the scent of pine slipped through the air vents, bringing with it a wave of memories. She had first smelled that same sharp, clean mountain scent more than 30 years ago when she and her late husband, Henry, had driven this very route. They were younger then, hopeful, searching for a quiet place where they could breathe away from the noise of their busy lives. Her fingertips softened on the wheel as the memory formed clearly in her mind. Henry laughing beside her, one hand on the map, the other pointing out at the horizon. She could almost hear his voice again describing the future he wanted for them. Mornings spent drinking coffee on a porch nestled in the trees. Evenings filled with soft music. Winters warmed by a wood-burning stove. The memory tightened her throat. The cabin had been their shared dream, their small rebellion against a world that demanded so much from them. Years later, after Henry's passing, she had finished the work alone. She had sanded floors, replaced broken window panes, and learned how to repair plumbing with a stubborn determination she didn't know she possessed. Each improvement, each repaired board, had been a conversation with him, a way of keeping him close. The mountains rose higher around her. She glanced at the dashboard clock, realizing how many years had passed since she first drove this road with hope instead of fear. She whispered his name once under her breath, not in sorrow, but in quiet remembrance. Her thoughts shifted to Daniel. Her son had once adored the cabin. As a boy, he had chased butterflies along the riverbed, dangled his feet from the old wooden bridge, and begged her to let him roast marshmallows even when the fire was too low. She remembered how he used to sleep with his head on Henry's shoulder during the ride back home, exhausted from playing outdoors. A faint smile touched her lips before fading into something heavier. When had that boy drifted so far from the man he became? When had he learned to dismiss her so easily? She knew adulthood changed people, but she had never imagined it would reshape him beyond recognition. The winding road grew narrower as she ascended the final stretch. The stars shone brighter, scattered like fragile silver dust across the sky. The quiet around her deepened until she could hear her own heartbeat. She tightened her grip on the wheel again. "I gave him everything I had," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Not just food and shelter. She had given him time, comfort, protection, the entire weight of her love. She had worked double shifts so he could attend summer programs. She had delayed her own dreams so he could pursue his education without debt. She had gone without rest, without praise, without acknowledgement. And now, the cabin, the only dream she had finally allowed herself to keep, had been taken without her knowledge. Not by strangers, but by the very people who claimed to be family. The thought sharpened something inside her. She lifted her chin. She was not driving to confront thieves. She was driving to reclaim a part of her life. A cluster of evergreens appeared at the bend in the road, marking the familiar turn toward her property. Her heart tightened as the gravel path came into view. Even in the darkness, she recognized every dip and curve. This land had held her through grief, loneliness, and fear. It had sheltered her spirit in ways no one else understood. Her headlights swept across the sign she had carved by hand. Quiet Haven. The wooden letters caught the light for a moment before disappearing into shadow again. She slowed the car, letting the weight of the moment settle. This place had been her refuge. And now it waited, unsure of what she would find inside. A faint glow peeked through the trees, her cabin porch light, the one she always left off when she wasn't home. Her breath hitched. She turned off the engine and let the silence wrap around her. For a long moment, she sat still, listening. She could hear laughter from inside the cabin. Light footsteps, the clinking of dishes. A life being lived in her home. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. The shock she expected did not come. Instead, she felt a deep, unwavering clarity. Whatever waited behind those walls, whatever changes, whatever violations, she would face them with a strength she had not realized she still possessed. She opened the door. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes for the first time in months. The cool mountain air brushed her hair back gently, almost as if welcoming her home. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring confrontation, but tonight belonged to truth. And the truth was simple. She had come back to reclaim what was hers. The gravel crunched sharply beneath Margaret Ellison's shoes as she approached the porch. Though the night air held the familiar scent of pine and damp earth, it no longer felt welcoming. The warm light pouring through her cabin windows cast soft rectangles across the ground, drifting with the shadows of people moving inside. Her home, once a sanctuary of silence and memories, now pulsed with unfamiliar life. She paused at the bottom of the wooden steps. Her breath hovered in her chest as she steadied herself. For a moment, she allowed her eyes to travel across the porch she and Henry had built together. His hands had carved the railing. She had painted the boards. They had argued playfully over where the bench should go. She could almost see him sitting there, still smiling at her with quiet pride. But the bench was gone. In its place stood a bright green folding chair, one she had never seen before, its color jarringly out of place. The small potted rosemary plant she kept near the door had been replaced by a tall decorative vase filled with artificial branches. The sight struck her like a cold slap. She reached for the door, not bothering to soften her footsteps. Her home had always greeted her with stillness. Tonight, it returned only noise. Laughter drifted out, muffled voices overlapped, and somewhere deep inside, a television played at a volume she never used. The door opened without resistance. Someone had unlocked it. She stepped inside. Her heart tightened. The living room had been rearranged beyond recognition. Her quilt, the one she made by hand during her first lonely winter after Henry's passing, had been folded and pushed aside onto a footstool. In its place lay a bright, patterned throw blanket that clashed with the warm wooden tones of the cabin. The photographs she once kept on the mantel were missing, replaced by decorative candles and a small speaker. Sophie appeared first, emerging from the hallway with a surprised expression that quickly melted into mild annoyance. She wore loose loungewear and carried a half-emptied bag of chips. She blinked at Margaret as though she were an unexpected guest and not the rightful owner. "Oh, you're here early," she said, casually. Margaret's voice was calm, though her pulse pounded. "Early for what?" Sophie shrugged. "We figured you'd come by tomorrow or something. Mom has plans for the curtains in your bedroom. She said the floral ones have to go." The words struck Margaret harder than the cold outside. Her floral curtains were ones she had sewn herself, matching them to the quilt she kept on her bed. They held pieces of her past memories stitched quietly into the seams. Voices approached from the kitchen. Helen appeared holding a mug of steaming tea. She smiled widely when she saw Margaret, but the expression carried a thin sheen of performance. "There you are, dear. We weren't expecting you tonight. The drive is long at your age." Margaret stiffened at the remark. It was wrapped in concern, but hollow enough to echo. Behind Helen came Thomas, moving with the casual confidence of someone evaluating property. He looked Margaret up and down with mild surprise, then offered a nod meant to pass as respect. "Well, Margaret, looks like you caught us in the middle of settling in," he said. "Daniel said this place was too big for one person. We'll help take care of it." Take care of it. As though her home were a burden she couldn't manage. As though they had come to rescue her from something instead of intruding into the last piece of her independence. Margaret drew a slow breath. She lifted her chin, grounding her voice. "This is my cabin. No one settles here without my permission." Thomas chuckled softly, surprised by her firmness. "We're all family now, Margaret. Sharing space is natural. Besides, you don't need all this room. We'll only use the main bedroom and the study." Margaret felt heat rise inside her, though her words remained composed. "You will not use anything here. I did not invite you." Helen stepped forward, her mug cradled delicately between her hands. "We thought we were helping dear. Daniel mentioned you live alone. We assumed this arrangement would ease your burden." Her burden, as though solitude were a weakness, as though independence were a flaw. Margaret walked past Helen, letting her gaze sweep across the kitchen. Her copper pots, the ones she polished each spring, were stacked in a cabinet she never used. The spice rack had been rearranged with unfamiliar jars. A large ceramic bowl she cherished was missing entirely. She turned back to them. Her voice was steady. All of you need to leave. Tonight. Sophie scoffed. Helen sighed. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Margaret, let's be reasonable, Thomas said. This place is perfect for community living. You'll see. We can make it work. But Margaret saw clearly now. Their casual invasion, their rearranging her belongings, their assumptions about what she needed, none of it was accidental. They had already envisioned a life here, a life built upon hers. Her decision sharpened into certainty. This conversation is over, she said. Leave my home. For the first time, their smiles faltered. A flicker of irritation crossed Thomas's face. Helen's polite mask slipped just enough to reveal impatience. Sophie muttered something under her breath. Margaret did not flinch. Her cabin, once the place she turned to for comfort, now stood at the edge of something larger, something that would demand more of her strength than she had expected. But as she faced the people standing in her living room, she realized something important. She was not afraid. The fight for her home had begun. Margaret Ellison stood in the center of her living room as the voices of the intruders drifted faintly from the kitchen. The air felt heavier here, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She turned slowly, taking in every detail of the space she had built piece by piece over the decades. Nothing looked the way she had left it. Every familiar object seemed displaced, overshadowed, or replaced entirely. Her gaze moved first to the bookshelf Henry had built during their first autumn in the mountains. He had chosen the wood carefully, sanding each plank while she brewed coffee beside him. The shelf had once held their shared collection of old poetry books and travel guides. Now, half the shelves were empty, the books stacked carelessly in a cardboard box pushed to the corner. In their place sat decorative trinkets, shiny and soulless things that reflected none of the history she cherished. A faint trembling spread through her hands. She pressed them together to steady herself. Her eyes traveled next to the fireplace. The framed photo of her and Henry that usually sat above the mantel was gone. She had taken that photo during their last summer together. The sunlight catching his gray hair as he laughed at something she no longer remembered. It had been her anchor during nights when grief felt unbearable. Now the spot where it belonged was occupied by a large scented candle, labeled with a brand she did not recognize. A soft click sounded behind her. Margaret turned to see the door to her bedroom ajar. A warm glow spilled into the hallway. She walked toward it slowly, each step echoing like footsteps through memory. The moment she crossed into the room, a breath caught in her throat. Her quilt was missing, the quilt she had stitched while mourning Henry's absence, choosing fabrics that reminded her of the places they had visited together. She had sewn mountains along the border, a blue patch for the lake they used to fish at, a maroon square symbolizing the sweater Henry wore every winter. It had taken her nearly a year to finish, and now it was gone. In its place lay a mass-produced comforter bright white with gold geometric patterns, something that looked like it belonged in a staged home rather than a lived one. Her floral curtains had been removed as well. The rods hung bare as though stripped of memory. A wave of dizziness passed over her. She placed a hand on the doorway to balance herself. This room had once been her refuge, a place where she curled up with old letters and listened to rain tapping against the windows. She used to fall asleep, clutching one of Henry's sweaters during the first winter she spent alone. Every corner of this room had held a piece of comfort she constructed for herself. Now the room looked like a stranger's temporary lodging, sterile, impersonal, stolen. Her knees weakened, but she remained standing. Behind her, footsteps approached. Helen's voice floated in gently, as though she were entering a home design project rather than someone else's heart. Margaret, I knew you'd love what we've done. The floral curtains were a bit outdated, and Sophie thought the bedding needed a fresh touch. Margaret didn't turn around. She stared at the empty curtain rods, her voice low. Where is my quilt? Helen hesitated. The old one. You mean that patchwork blanket? We put it in storage. It didn't match the new aesthetic. Aesthetic. The word struck like a blade. Margaret closed her eyes. She remembered Henry placing the first strip of fabric across her lap the night she began sewing. She remembered promising herself that the quilt would warm her through whatever life brought after he was gone. It had been more than a blanket. It had been survival. She opened her eyes again, focusing not on the sterile comforter but on the empty space where her memories once lived. Helen spoke again, oblivious to the storm rising inside Margaret. "We'll bring in a crew tomorrow to repaint. Sophie likes neutral colors. They make a space feel less lonely." Less lonely. Helen couldn't have known how cruelly those words landed. Or perhaps she did. Margaret finally turned. Her expression was calm, but her eyes no longer held softness. "This isn't your home," she said quietly. Helen blinked as though she hadn't heard correctly. "We're improving it, dear. You'll understand when things settle. Change is good at your age." At your age. Another small cut. Margaret walked past her without another word. Each step felt heavier yet more grounded, as though the house were giving her strength even in its altered state. She entered the hallway, noticing now the dozens of small intrusions she had missed earlier. The rug she bought during a trip with Henry had been rolled up and shoved aside. The wooden coat rack Daniel made for her in high school was hidden behind a stack of luggage. Even the subtle scent of lavender she always kept in the cabin was overwhelmed by unfamiliar perfumes. Her sanctuary had been overwritten. She paused in the center of the hallway. A deep silence settled around her despite the distant murmur of conversation from the kitchen. In that silence, a realization crystallized. They had not simply moved into her cabin. They had erased her. Her memories, her effort, her history, her meaning, all swept aside to make room for their convenience. Margaret inhaled slowly, grounding herself. The pain did not shrink. It sharpened, into clarity, into resolve. This was no longer about discomfort or rudeness. It was about survival. The survival of her identity, her independence, her dignity. She stepped back into the living room, her spine straightening. Thomas looked up from the couch, raising an eyebrow as though assessing a negotiation. Margaret met his gaze with unwavering steadiness. "You all need to leave," she said. Her voice was quiet, but every syllable carried weight. "Not tomorrow, not next week, tonight." Silence filled the room. Thomas opened his mouth to argue. Helen's expression tightened. Sophie scoffed under her breath, but Margaret no longer cared. They had destroyed the illusion of politeness when they touched her memories. This fight was no longer optional. It was necessary. The collapse of her past had awakened something fierce, and it would not be silenced again. Margaret stood in the quiet cabin living room, the faint hum of the mountain wind pressing against the windows. Her heart was still raw from what she had just seen. The rearranged rooms, the missing quilt, the faint scent of someone else's perfume soaking into the walls. Yet, as she tried to steady her breathing, another wave of realization moved through her, softer but no less painful. These dismissals, they had not begun today. They had been happening for months. She just hadn't allowed herself to see them. Margaret lowered herself into the armchair by the window, the one spot in the cabin that still felt untouched. Through the glass, the pine trees swayed under a gray sky, their movement slow, steady, indifferent to human failures. She rested her palms on the wooden armrests and let memory pull her backward. It began with the engagement announcement. She remembered Daniel calling her on a weekday morning, sounding rushed, distracted. "We're engaged, Mom. Rachel's family already booked the venue. You'll love it." Booked the venue. Already. She hadn't even met Rachel's parents then. She hadn't been asked for a date preference or whether she could help. She remembered quietly congratulating him, then hanging up and staring at the clock on her kitchen wall. Something had stung that morning, like a small pinch she brushed aside. Now she saw it clearly. She had been excluded from the beginning. Her mind drifted to the invitation design. She remembered offering to pay for printing costs as a wedding gift. Daniel had smiled politely and said, "Rachel has a vision for the invitations. She's handling it." Vision. That word had sounded strange then. but not painful. Next came the rehearsal dinner plans. She remembered showing up early, carrying a tray of homemade rolls, Henry's recipe, the one Daniel always loved as a boy. But when she entered the restaurant, the Morrison family was already seated, menus laid out, the seating chart finalized. Helen had taken the tray from her with a smile that felt brittle around the edges. "Oh, Margaret, we already ordered everything, but thank you, dear. I'm sure someone will enjoy these later." She had placed the rolls on a counter and taken her seat, telling herself not to make a fuss. Daniel barely looked up that evening, his laughter directed toward Rachel's father, the two bonding over business stories she couldn't follow. Another pinch she ignored. Margaret inhaled slowly, fingers tightening on the armrest. The pattern continued. The group chat for wedding updates did not include her until weeks after it had begun. When she mentioned it, Rachel smiled apologetically. "We didn't want to overwhelm you. Tech stuff can be a lot, right?" Tech stuff. As though she hadn't spent 35 years mastering the sorting machines and digital systems of a modern post office. Then there were the dress fittings. She remembered suggesting a navy gown she had worn only once. Rachel's reaction replayed vividly now. "It's sweet, Margaret, but the photographer prefers a neutral palette, maybe something beige or silver, something that blends." That word, blends. She hadn't thought much of it then. She simply bought the beige dress. She wanted peace. She wanted harmony. But now she saw the truth. They had been asking her to fade into the background long before they stepped into her cabin. A quiet ache spread across her chest. Not anger, something heavier, a mourning. She mourned the version of Daniel who once clung to her hand during thunderstorms, who begged her to read one more chapter before bed, who carved a wooden coat rack for her birthday in high school. She mourned the closeness that had slowly eroded, grain by grain, like a shoreline disappearing under relentless waves. Margaret blinked hard and exhaled. Her eyes drifted to the fireplace mantel, the empty space where her photo with Henry once stood. She imagined his gentle expression, the warmth he carried even in silence. Henry had always known how to read her worry. He would have seen these dismissals long before she did. Maybe she thought she didn't want to believe her son could treat her this way. Maybe denial had been easier than the truth. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windows, pulling her mind back to the present. Footsteps moved in the hallway. Sophie humming to herself as though this were her vacation home. Helen's voice floated in from the kitchen, discussing paint colors. Thomas rustled through papers with the confidence of someone preparing to take ownership. Margaret sat straighter. The dismissal had stopped being subtle. It had become intrusion, and intrusion was becoming possession. She could feel her pulse steadying now, not with fear, but clarity. Everything suddenly made sense. She rose from the chair and walked slowly toward the kitchen doorway. She heard Thomas saying something about long-term plans, and Helen commenting on making the place more functional. A cold calm settled over her. This would not continue. She understood now what these months had been leading to. A systematic erasure of her role, her voice, her boundaries. But they had underestimated her. She had survived widowhood, financial strain, loneliness, and decades of relentless work. She had rebuilt her life from silence and perseverance, and she would not disappear simply because someone preferred her to fade. Margaret stepped into the kitchen doorway. None of them noticed her yet. But they would, because the woman who entered that room was no longer confused, no longer hesitant. She finally saw the truth, and she was ready to fight for what was hers. Margaret Ellison stood in the narrow hallway of her mountain cabin, feeling the weight of every altered detail pressing against her ribs. The missing quilt, the stripped curtain rods, the rearranged furniture, the voices of the Morrison family drifting through her home like they owned the air itself. She had held her grief, her shock, and her disbelief as long as any person reasonably could. But now something inside her clicked into place, a quiet, resolute finality. She stepped into the living room. Thomas sat confidently on her couch, legs crossed, flipping through a real estate magazine as though preparing for a meeting. Helen arranged throw pillows that were not hers. Sophie lounged near the window, scrolling on her phone, the glow reflecting off her indifferent expression. None of them looked up. That, more than anything, solidified Margaret's resolve. She inhaled deeply and spoke. "Everyone needs to get out of my cabin. You have 48 hours. Her voice was calm, steady. It cut through the room like a clean blade. Helen froze mid-gesture, a pillow half-tucked beside her. Sophie lowered her phone an inch. Thomas slowly lifted his gaze, eyebrows raised in a mixture of amusement and irritation. "Margaret," he said, as though addressing a confused neighbor, "we're settling in." The word made her jaw tighten. Margaret walked farther into the room. "This cabin belongs to me. No one stays here without my permission. And I never gave it." Thomas leaned back, fingers tapping his magazine. "Daniel assured us it was available. He said you rarely use it. Why let such a valuable property sit empty when it can support the entire family's future?" Support, future. Words that translated to one thing: possession. Margaret's expression didn't change. 48 hours, she repeated. Not a minute more. Sophie groaned dramatically. "This is so unfair. I need somewhere peaceful to reset. The city is overwhelming. You can't expect me to go back." Margaret met her eyes. "Your situation is not my responsibility." Helen stepped forward, her tone coated in false sympathy. "We're trying to help, dear. You shouldn't be alone up here. A woman your age needs support. We can make this place more functional for everyone." A woman your age. Support. Functional. The familiar condescension landed with precision. They were not here to share. They were here to absorb, to reshape her sanctuary into something that served them. Margaret remained unshaken. "Pack your things." Thomas's polite facade began to crack. "You're being unreasonable. This is a family decision. Daniel's decision." Margaret stepped closer. "Daniel doesn't own this cabin. I do." The room stilled. Thomas rose slowly from the couch. For the first time, there was open irritation in his posture, a tightening of his shoulders, a shift in his jawline. "You're making a mistake. We're offering stability, a shared retirement plan. You should be grateful someone cares enough to involve you." Grateful. Involve. Margaret felt something like steel form in her spine. "My life is not a project for you to manage." Helen attempted one more nudge. "Let's be reasonable. Blended families thrive when resources are combined. Why cling to this place alone?" Margaret turned toward the window. Outside, the mountain wind swept over the trees, bending them but never breaking them. That was what her years of work had been. Bending, yielding, but never surrendering. She faced them again. "This cabin is mine. My husband and I restored it with our own hands. I am not combining it with anyone's anything." Thomas scoffed. "If you're worried about legality, don't. Daniel gave verbal permission. We're family." Margaret lifted her chin. Verbal permission from someone who doesn't own the property means nothing. The silence that followed was sharp. Helen's voice faltered. You wouldn't actually force us out?" Margaret answered without hesitation. "I already have." The Morrison family exchanged glances, first disbelief, then indignation, then a dawning understanding that the woman standing before them was not bending. Thomas broke the silence. "So, what happens in 48 hours? Margaret didn't blink. "I file a formal removal, and a sheriff will escort you out." For the first time, real alarm flickered across Helen's face. Sophie dropped her phone entirely. Thomas stared at Margaret, calculating, assessing whether she was bluffing. She wasn't. He finally spoke, voice low. "Daniel won't like this." Margaret steadied her breath. "Daniel doesn't decide what happens here." The truth hung heavy between them, solid and immovable. From the kitchen window, the last of the daylight slipped behind the ridge, casting the room in a cool gray. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint wind nudging the eaves of the cabin. Margaret took one final step back, granting them space they no longer deserved. 48 hours, she said once more. Use them well. Then she turned, walked down the hallway, and closed the bedroom door behind her. Not gently, not harshly, but with the calm certainty of someone who had reclaimed the ground beneath her feet. The confrontation was over. The war for her home had just begun. Margaret Ellison woke before sunrise. The cabin was silent, except for the low whisper of wind threading through the pine branches. She sat at the small wooden table in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a warm mug, waiting for the sky to lighten. Her decision from the previous evening had settled inside her like solid stone. There was no trembling now, no hesitation, only clarity. Today she would begin the formal process. The Morrison family still slept in the rooms they had claimed. She heard a door close softly down the hall and the muffled thud of someone opening the refrigerator. Their movements felt invasive, even at this early hour, but it no longer rattled her. The countdown had started. She reached for her phone and dialed the attorney who had handled the cabin purchase many years ago. The call connected with a crisp click. She spoke calmly. "My cabin has been occupied without my permission. I need to begin removal procedures." The attorney listened, asked questions, and confirmed what she already knew in her heart. The property was solely hers. No verbal permission from Daniel could override her ownership. No in-law had any standing to remain. The attorney prepared the documents immediately and arranged for the county sheriff to conduct a visit after the required notice period. By the time Margaret ended the call, sunlight had begun slipping through the treetops. A surge of quiet relief warmed her chest. She printed the notice, walked to the front door, and taped it firmly where no one could miss it. The paper looked almost fragile against the thick pine wood, but its meaning carried weight. The Morrison family would have 48 hours to vacate. After that, their presence would be considered unlawful occupancy. Behind her, a voice cut through the morning. "What is this?" Helen stood in her robe, hair loosely pinned, eyes scanning the notice with disbelief. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with insult. Margaret kept her tone even. "Legal notice. You have until tomorrow morning to leave." Helen recoiled as if struck. "You cannot be serious. We are family." Margaret met her gaze without blinking. Family does not take what is not theirs. Thomas appeared next, rubbing sleep from his eyes. When he saw the notice, his jaw tightened. He stepped closer, looming in a way that once might have intimidated her. "This is an overreaction. We are trying to create stability for everyone." Margaret held her ground. "This is my home. You were warned." Thomas scoffed. "You wouldn't dare involve the authorities." Margaret said nothing. She did not need to. The notice spoke for her. The day crawled forward with strained silence. Helen wandered through the cabin, muttering under her breath. Sophie slammed drawers while packing and unpacking her suitcase, as if undecided whether to obey. Thomas paced near the window, making calls she suspected were attempts to gather leverage or sympathy. But none of their noise penetrated Margaret's focus. She changed the cabin locks on the storage shed, checked that her documents were secure, and gathered photographs of Henry that she refused to see, mishandled again. By late afternoon, tension had thickened the air. "He's not coming," Thomas muttered from the living room. "No sheriff is wasting his time on this." Margaret did not respond. She simply waited. When the sun dipped behind the mountain ridge and shadows stretched across the cabin floor, footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. A firm knock sounded at the door. Helen gasped. Sophie stiffened. Thomas straightened, disbelief flashing across his face. Margaret opened the door. The county sheriff stood tall, hat tucked under his arm, expression calm but authoritative. "Evening, Mom. We received a request regarding unauthorized occupancy. May I come in?" Margaret stepped aside. "Of course!" Helen rushed forward, hands clasped dramatically. "Officer, there must be a misunderstanding. We are helping her. She should not be living alone in a place like this." The sheriff listened politely but did not soften. "Is your name on the deed to this cabin?" Helen blinked. Well, no, but... The sheriff turned to Thomas. Yours? Thomas hesitated. No, but her son Daniel said. The sheriff interrupted with a firm shake of his head. Verbal permission from a non-owner does not grant occupancy rights. The property belongs to Ms. Ellison. You were given notice. You need to pack your things and leave immediately. Sophie's eyes widened. You cannot kick us out like this. We didn't do anything wrong. Margaret's voice was steady. You moved into my home without asking. That was wrong. The sheriff nodded in agreement. If you refuse to leave, I will have to escort you off the property. Silence filled the room. Heavy. Absolute. For the first time since they had arrived, the Morrison family looked genuinely unsure of themselves. Helen whispered, This isn't fair. Margaret met her eyes. Neither was what you did. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to gather their belongings. Suitcases rolled across the floor, closets opened and closed. Helen wrapped her decorative items in towels. Thomas carried boxes to their car with tight shoulders. Sophie huffed angrily as she loaded her bags. Margaret watched without triumph and without apology. She felt only closure. When the final car door slammed shut, the sheriff turned to her. If there are further issues, you let us know. Margaret nodded. Thank you. The sheriff tipped his hat and left, his truck disappearing down the winding road. The cabin grew quiet, peaceful, hers again. Margaret closed the door gently and stood in the center of the living room, feeling air move differently now that the weight of intrusion had lifted. For the first time in days, she let out a full breath. Her home was hers, and she had reclaimed it. The cabin was silent again. Truly silent. Not the strained stillness that had filled it while the Morrison family wandered from room to room, but the deep, natural quiet the mountains had always offered Margaret. She stood near the front door just after the sheriff's truck disappeared down the winding road. Her hand rested on the wood as if confirming it was real and solid under her fingertips. For the first time in days, she felt space, air, control. But the quiet also revealed the damage. Not broken walls or shattered furniture, but something deeper. Her home had been touched by hands that did not honor it. Her memories had been shifted, boxed, or pushed aside. The long hours of sanding floors with Henry, the quilt she had sewn through grief, the tiny details she had placed with intention. All of it felt bruised. Margaret moved slowly into the living room. The furniture sat at odd angles. A vase that was not hers stood on the mantel where her photo with Henry belonged. A blanket Sophie had used was tossed over the couch as if claiming territory. She exhaled softly and whispered, Enough. She began with the mantel. Her fingers brushed aside the decorative candle and lifted the familiar frame from where she had placed it earlier for safekeeping. Henry smiled back at her, his eyes soft with the warmth she still carried in her chest. She set the photo in its rightful spot and stepped back. The cabin already felt more like itself. She collected items the Morrisons had brought, dishware she would never use, textiles that clashed with the natural tones she and Henry had chosen, and placed them by the door to discard later. With each object removed, the room breathed easier. Next, she tackled the bedroom. The impersonal comforter was folded and placed into a bag she would donate. The bare curtain rods waited like open arms. She retrieved her floral curtains from the storage chest and hung them again. The soft fabric fell into place with a gentle familiarity. Then came the quilt. It had been tucked away in a storage bin squeezed between luggage the Morrisons had brought. She unfolded it carefully. The mountain patchwork Henry had admired so many years ago glowed in the afternoon light. She pressed the fabric to her cheek and closed her eyes. Her throat tightened with something equal parts relief and sorrow. She spread the quilt across the bed. Suddenly, the entire room softened. The sharp edges of intrusion dissolved into something warm again. Margaret moved through her home for hours. She dusted shelves, wiped counters, and opened windows to let the cabin breathe. The scent of pine filtered in, sweeping away the perfumes that had lingered. She replaced her rug in the hallway, straightened the coat rack Daniel once made, and restored the kitchen table to its place by the window. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, she stepped outside. The porch creaked softly under her weight. Wildflowers bent in the gentle wind. The mountains glowed with a quiet gold, unbothered by human conflict. This land had always been steady even when life was not. Margaret leaned on the railing and let her thoughts settle. She felt the cabin settling too, as if the walls themselves were welcoming her back. A new calm unfolded inside her. Not the fragile stillness that comes after chaos, but something sturdier, something earned. She realized this was more than reclaiming a house. It was reclaiming herself, her boundaries, her voice, her history. Daniel had once been the center of her world. She had built her life around raising him well, but this moment showed her that she could no longer live in the shadow of other people's expectations, not even his. She stepped back inside and closed the door. The cabin held a new stillness, now one that felt like a promise of the life she would continue shaping on her own terms. She walked into the kitchen and poured herself a cup of tea. The steam rose in lazy curls. She sat by the window and looked out at the fading light. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel lonely. She felt free. This was her space, her peace, her new beginning, and no one would ever take it from her again. Morning light seeped through the kitchen window as Margaret Ellison stood barefoot on the wooden floor of her restored cabin. The silence felt cleaner now. It was no longer haunted by the weight of uninvited voices or hurried footsteps. The cabin breathed in rhythm with the mountain wind, and for the first time in weeks, she felt her shoulders loosen. She stepped outside onto the porch with a cup of warm tea. The sky stretched wide above her, streaked with pale gold. Birds fluttered among the pines. The familiar creak of the porch boards grounded her. The world looked unchanged, yet she was different now. Her phone buzzed gently in her pocket. A message, followed by another, then another. She returned inside and set the cup down before checking the screen. Carol from the nearby cabin had texted first. Heard what happened. Heading your way in a bit. Bringing cake. Margaret blinked at the words. Carol was the type who always noticed when the trash bins needed help or when the road froze over steep turns. Her presence meant steadiness. Another message came from her friend Linda from the post office where they had worked together for decades. You were right to stand your ground. Proud of you. A third came from Ed, who now lived 2 towns over but still remembered every detail about the cabin from when he helped install the water heater. You need anything, let me know. I have tools and a truck. Margaret sat at the wooden table reading the messages twice. Their simplicity surprised her. Their sincerity steadied her. She had been bracing herself for judgment or gossip, but instead, she felt a soft circle forming around her, a quiet support she had forgotten she still had. A knock echoed lightly at the door. She opened it to find Carol holding a cake tin wrapped in a dish towel. Her silver hair was tucked under a knit cap and her cheeks were flushed from the cold. Carol stepped inside without waiting for formality. My goodness, it looks like you're home again. I knew something was off when I saw those unfamiliar cars up here. Margaret exhaled a small laugh. It feels like I can breathe again. Carol set the cake tin down. You should. You did what many of us wish we had the courage to do. People walk over us when we are quiet. You reminded everyone that quiet does not mean weak. The words landed warmly. Margaret felt her throat tighten with something neither sadness nor joy, but a mixture that made her heart fuller. Carol stayed for a cup of tea. They talked about small things at first, the weather, the upcoming community dinner, the state of the hiking trails. But it all felt deeply comforting, familiar, real. When Carol left, Margaret returned to her cleaning routine. She scrubbed the counters until the wood shone again. She polished the windows. She dusted the corners of the living room. Every movement reconnected her to the cabin, one gesture at a time. In the afternoon, she stepped outside to tidy the garden beds. The soil was cool beneath her gloves. She trimmed the dried stems of wildflowers and cleared fallen branches. The rhythm calmed her. The mountains surrounded her in a steady embrace. As she worked, she thought of the life she once imagined for her retirement after Henry passed. A life of solitude, but not loneliness. A life where her days were shaped by choice, not obligation. A life lived quietly, but fully in a place she and Henry had built together. The cabin had almost slipped away from her, but now she stood firmly rooted again. The sun dipped lower, and Margaret sat on the porch bench with a blanket around her legs. A soft breeze rustled the treetops. It carried the scent of pine and damp earth. She whispered to herself, "I am still here. Not swept aside. Not erased. Here." The road ahead would not be without complications. Daniel still had to face the consequences of his choices. There would be difficult conversations. There would be boundaries to redraw. There would be heartache to confront. But she was no longer afraid of those things. The support of the people around her reminded her of something she had nearly forgotten. She was not alone. She had community. She had strength. She had her home. And she had herself. As dusk settled across the mountains, Margaret closed her eyes and rested her head against the cabin wall. The air cooled, the sky dimmed. Peace did not come all at once, but it arrived in gentle waves, and she allowed herself to receive it. Margaret Ellison woke to a soft vibration on her nightstand. Morning light had barely begun to seep through the curtains when she reached for the phone. A single notification glowed on the screen, one new message from Rachel. For a brief moment, Margaret simply stared at it. Her heartbeat remained steady, but something cold brushed the edge of her thoughts. She knew what this would be. She knew the rhythm of accusations that came after people lost control of something they thought they owned. She opened the message. "You ruined everything. My parents were trying to help. Daniel is devastated. I hope you can live with what you have done." The sharpness of the words did not surprise her. What surprised her was the calm that settled over her as she read them. She could almost hear Rachel's voice behind each sentence, clipped tight with entitlement, dressed in disappointment. Margaret placed the phone gently on the table. The cabin felt quiet and safe around her. The quilt lay warm across her legs. The morning breeze brushed the curtains like a soft reassurance. None of the accusations in the message belonged to her. She rose from bed and moved to the kitchen where she brewed a cup of tea. The familiar scent of leaves steeping in hot water grounded her more deeply than any apology ever could. As she stirred the spoon, she let the silence settle. She checked the phone again. Another message appeared. "You embarrassed our family. You acted selfishly. You made us look unstable." Margaret exhaled through her nose. She felt neither guilt nor anger. What she felt was distance, a widening space between herself and a woman who had tried for months to fit her into a smaller shape. She typed no response. Instead, she silenced the phone and set it upside down. She carried her tea to the porch. Outside, the mountains were wrapped in pale mist. Pine needles shimmered with dew. The cabin felt restored not only in appearance, but in its grounding presence. She inhaled slowly, letting the crisp air cleanse the last remnants of doubt. Her peace was interrupted a few minutes later. The phone buzzed again, then again, then again. She ignored the first 3 messages, then finally picked it up when the 4th came through. "If Daniel loses his stability because of this, I will never forgive you." Margaret read the sentence twice. She felt a brief pressure in her chest, not from fear, but from the heavy recognition of how deeply Rachel believed her own narrative. In Rachel's world, accountability was an inconvenience. Boundaries were attacks, and consequences were always someone else's fault. Margaret set the phone aside and folded the blanket around her shoulders. Her gaze drifted to the wildflowers near the porch, where sunlight had just begun to reach. She thought of Henry. She imagined what he would say if he were here, something gentle, something firm, something that reminded her she had done the right thing. She whispered quietly, "You would understand." Back inside the cabin, she washed the breakfast dishes. The simple routine had never felt more grounding. She wiped the counters, opened the windows, and let sunlight warm the wooden floors. The phone buzzed again, but she did not look this time. She did not need to. She already knew the shape of Rachel's final attempt. Her thoughts drifted to Daniel then. Her son, who had once carved a wooden rack for her out of scraps from his high school workshop. Her son, who used to run into the cabin laughing, his jacket half-zipped, shouting about the trout he and Henry had spotted in the lake. She felt a quiet ache. Not regret, not guilt. A mourning for the boy who had trusted her and a recognition that the man he had become was tangled in pressures she did not fully understand. But she also knew one truth that had taken her years to learn. Loving someone does not mean surrendering yourself. By late afternoon, she finally picked up her phone. One last message from Rachel filled the screen. "You will regret this." Margaret stared at it for a long moment. The cabin was still. The air was clean. Her heart was steady. She pressed one button. Block. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was release. She set the phone down and stepped out onto the porch again. The mountains stretched endlessly before her. The sky was open, clear, unwavering. Rachel's final push had not shaken her. It had crystallized something. Her boundaries, her strength, her sovereignty over her own life. From this point forward, Margaret knew her peace would not depend on the approval of someone who never saw her clearly. She folded her arms gently across her chest, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun. She was done shrinking. She was done apologizing for existing. And she was done allowing chaos to disguise itself as family. The day felt lighter, because she had chosen herself. 6 months passed. Winter snow melted from the roof of Margaret Ellison's cabin. Ice gave way to soft earth, and the mountain air warmed with the scent of pine. Spring sunlight draped across the porch as she swept the last patch of lingering frost from the wooden steps. The cabin felt different now. Lighter. Settled. Its silence was no longer a shield, but a companion. She had spent the past months tending to small things that brought her peace, repainting the bedroom window frames, organizing Henry's tools, restoring the wildflower beds, and walking along the ridge each morning. Her days had rhythm, and her mind had room again. She rarely thought of the Morrisons now. Their voices no longer echoed in the hallways of her memory. Rachel had never contacted her again. Helen and Thomas had disappeared into their own world of decisions. And Sophie had been nothing more than a brief shadow passing through a place that was never hers. Daniel, however, lingered in her thoughts more than she wished. Not with the sharp ache she once felt, but with a quiet, unresolved thread that tugged lightly when the evenings grew still. The distance between them had widened after the confrontation. Not a fight, not a rupture, a quiet drifting. Like two boats that had once been tied together by a strong rope, now separated by a loosened knot. Margaret did not chase him. For the first time in her life, she let silence sit where it needed to. One cool afternoon, she was trimming the herb garden beside the porch when she heard footsteps crunching along the gravel driveway. Slow, hesitant steps. She straightened quietly. A tall figure appeared between the trees. Shoulders slightly hunched, hands in his jacket pockets. Daniel. He looked smaller somehow. Or maybe it was the weight he carried that made him appear so. His face was tired shadows beneath his eyes, the kind that do not come from lack of sleep, but from months of emotional strain. Margaret stood still, letting him approach on his own terms. He stopped at the edge of the porch. His voice broke the silence. "Mom." She nodded gently. Daniel. A long pause stretched between them, filled with all the words they had not spoken. He shifted his weight, looking as if he might walk away, but instead he lifted his gaze to hers. His eyes glistened. "I am sorry." The words landed softly. Not dramatic, not forced. Real. He swallowed hard. "I was wrong. About everything. I let them decide things for me. I let them speak for me. I let them use your place as if it were nothing." He inhaled shakily. "And I let them turn me against you. I do not know how I let that happen." Margaret felt the slow tightening in her chest loosen. She stepped to the edge of the porch but did not close the distance fully. "Not yet." Daniel continued. "When Rachel left, she told everyone it was your fault." "But it was me." I made choices that hurt people. I should have protected you. I should have respected you. His shoulders shook slightly. She had not seen her son this vulnerable since he was a child. He wiped his cheek. I am trying to fix my life. I am in therapy. I moved out of the city. I am working remotely now, just trying to breathe again. But I needed to come here. I needed to see you. I needed to say it to your face. Margaret stepped down one wooden stair. Her voice was soft, but steady. I hear you. He looked up again, hoping for absolution, something simple that would erase the distance in one gesture. But Margaret had lived too long and survived too much to offer easy answers. She spoke gently. I accept your apology, truly. But trust is not rebuilt in a day. It grows slowly, through choices, through consistency, through respect. Daniel nodded, though his eyes flickered with a trace of disappointment. Not at her words, but at the truth of them. She motioned toward the porch bench. Sit. He did. She sat beside him, leaving a comfortable space between them. The mountains stretched wide before them, the pines rustling in a warm breeze. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence was not cold now. It was a place between them where something new could grow. Daniel finally whispered, I miss you, Mom. Margaret looked out at the ridge. I miss you too. But I do not miss being unheard. He nodded slowly, absorbing the meaning. She added quietly, we move forward, but we do it with boundaries that protect both of us. Daniel closed his eyes as though the words lifted something heavy from his shoulders. They sat there until the sky shifted to a soft evening gold. No dramatic reconciliation, no sweeping embrace. Just a beginning. A new shape forming between them, one defined not by obligation or guilt, but by clarity. As the breeze settled, Margaret felt something ease in her spirit. Not forgiveness alone, but something steadier. Renewal. Daniel stood to leave. I will call you tomorrow. She nodded once. Okay. He walked down the path, glancing back only once before disappearing between the trees. Margaret stayed on the porch, listening to the steady hum of the mountains. This was not a perfect ending, but it was honest, and honesty was enough to begin again.